The world ran on fasteners that fit nothing but themselves. I had understood this in the abstract for weeks, had seen it every time a bolt was handed up and the nut had to be tried, rejected, tried again, a third one fetched from across the workshop before something close enough was found. Every thread in Iron Ridge was a one-off. Every bolt had been hand-filed to its own private geometry, mated to a single nut, and never meant to meet another. A world of one-offs, each piece locked in a kind of loneliness. That ends now, I told them. And I meant it the way I meant most things I said in that workshop, not as encouragement, but as a statement of what the work required. The problem, as usual, was that the solution required itself. To cut a uniform thread, the carriage of the lathe had to move at a steady, predictable rate, one precise lateral increment for every full rotation of the spindle. The mechanism that drove the carriage at that steady rate was the lead screw, and the lead screw was simply a very accurate screw, which meant that to make accurate screws, you needed an accurate lead screw, and to make an accurate lead screw, you needed Cho Yeong got there before I finished the sentence. You need an accurate screw, she said, setting down the lap she'd been cleaning. She stared at the ceiling for a moment. The thing to make the thing. Again, she pressed her palms against her eyes. I hate this. I love this. I hate this. I had no comfort to offer her, because she was right on all counts, but I had a method. The escape from the paradox is old, older than any kingdom I knew, I suspected, though I had no way to prove it here. You begin not with a perfect screw, but with a near enough one, and then you let the screw correct itself. The geometry is simple. Take a true cylinder, and we had those now, scraped to roundness through the same three-plate logic we'd used on the surface plates, and wrap an angled strip of thin material around it at a consistent pitch. The strip scribes a helix on the cylinder's surface. That helix is not perfect. The strip has thickness variations, the hand that holds it has pressure variations, the cylinder itself carries whatever small residual errors survive scraping. But the helix is near enough. It is a rough thread, and rough threads can be corrected. I sketched it out in ash on the flat stone we kept by the forge for exactly this purpose, a wide diagram showing the cylinder, the angled strip, the resulting spiral line. Baek Da-ho leaned over it with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long time. 40 years I cut threads by eye and prayer, he said finally. His voice was not bitter. It was something closer to wonder, the particular flatness of a man recalculating a long-held belief. A wrapped strip and a straight cylinder, that simple, that maddening. We made the rough screw from iron stock that Taeho had drawn down to consistent diameter over 3 days of patient forge work. The helix was scribed, then cut, not deeply, not with any pretense of final accuracy, just enough to establish the form. What we had at the end of that first pass was a lead screw that was wrong in a dozen small ways, its pitch gaining and losing across its length in patterns that no eye could fully track. That was fine, that was expected, the method depends on it. The correction step is lapping. You thread the rough screw through a long nut, long enough that it spans several pitches at once, and work it back and forth with abrasive between them. The length of the nut is the key. A short nut follows the local error. A long nut averages across it. Where the pitch is tight, the nut bears harder and cuts more. Where the pitch is loose, it bears less and cuts less. Over many passes, the errors are sanded into agreement with each other. The screw teaches itself to be straight. Seo-rin ran the measurement side of this. She had developed a system, her own, arrived at without my prompting, of marking the nut's position at each full rotation and recording where it ran tight and where it eased. Her notes accumulated on a strip of paper she kept rolled in her sleeve, columns of small, precise characters that mapped the lead screw's errors as a landscape of gains and losses. It gains a hair here, loses it there, she said on the second morning, tracing a finger down her record. Lap longer here. We are sanding the errors into agreement. The screw teaches itself to be straight, I said. She looked up from her notes. Yes, exactly that. Cho Yeong did not work from records. She worked from her hands. This had been true since the surface plate days. Her palms and fingertips held a calibration that none of our gauges could fully replicate, some integration of pressure and warmth, and the faint drag of metal on skin that told her things the instruments confirmed only afterward. She ran the lead screw through the lapping nut, and then drew it out, and ran her fingers along the thread flanks with her eyes closed, moving slowly from one end to the other. Tight, she said. Tight, then it opens up right here. She stopped, her fingers resting on a stretch perhaps a third of the way from the driven end. The thread breathes unevenly. Lap that stretch and it'll settle. We lapped that stretch. We measured. We lapped again. This time there was no panic in it. We had learned the shape of this kind of work. The team that had nearly broken apart in the 8th week, when the surface plates refused to converge, and Dogwang had sat down on the floor and said he didn't know if any of this was possible, that team was gone. What remained were people who understood that correction was not failure. Correction was the process. You just keep walking it toward true. The days had a rhythm. Lap, measure, record, adjust, lap again. Cho Yeong and Seo-rin worked in a kind of wordless alternation, one reading with instruments, the other reading with hands, their findings seldom disagreeing by more than the width of a notation. Taeho kept the abrasive compound fresh and the lapping nut true. Mok Jae fetched and carried and watched everything with the focused attention of someone memorizing a language. Dogwang, still moving carefully on his healing leg, managed the fire and the oil and the small logistics that kept the work from stopping. On the 4th day, we had a lead screw. Not a perfect one. I want to be precise about this because precision is the point. We had a lead screw that was accurate within the limits of what our lapping and measurement could verify, which meant it was accurate within the limits of our best gauges, which meant it was more accurate than anything that had existed in Iron Ridge before that morning. It was, by the standards of what we were building toward, a beginning. By the standards of what had existed before, it was extraordinary. Dogwang fitted it to the lathe himself, working slowly and carefully, his big hands unexpectedly gentle around the bearing housings. When it was seated and the drive linkage connected, he stepped back and looked at it for a moment. So the machine makes the screws now, he said, even-handed, every time. Every time, I said. That's the word that changes everything, though. Every time. He nodded slowly, turning the phrase over. I could see him understanding it, not just the mechanical fact, but the implication that spread out from it in every direction. We ran the first thread-cutting pass that afternoon. The lathe spindle turned, the lead screw drove the carriage at its steady rate, and the cutting tool traced a helix into the iron rod clamped between centers. One pass, then a second, then a third as we deepened the cut incrementally. When we pulled the finished piece and threaded a nut onto it, a nut we had cut on the same lathe with the same lead screw, it ran smooth from end to end, without a tight spot, without a loose spot, without any of the small hesitations that hand-cut threads always carried. Cho Yeong held it up. She turned it over. She ran the nut down its length and back again, and her expression went through something I didn't have a word for. Not quite disbelief, not quite satisfaction, something between them. It's making a better one than the one we fought for, she said. The babies are better than the parents again. She was right. The lathe-cut thread was more consistent than the master lead screw that drove it, because the lead screw's small residual errors averaged out over the length of the cut in a way that no single-point hand operation could replicate. This is the nature of the method. The machine inherits the master's accuracy and then exceeds it because the machine is patient and consistent in ways that hands cannot be. Mok Jae had been standing at the edge of the group, and now he pushed forward. He picked up the bolt. He picked up a second nut, one we had cut earlier, from a separate rod, and threaded it on. It ran smooth. He picked up a third nut, also smooth. He went through every nut we had cut that day, 6 of them, and every one ran the full length of the bolt without complaint. They all fit each other. He looked up, and his face was doing something that I recognized from my own early years in my grandfather's shop. The expression of a person who has just understood something that will reorganize everything else they know. Master Han, do you know what this means? It means we can build the same thing twice, I said. That's the whole game. He stood there holding the bolt and a fistful of interchangeable nuts, and I let him stand there because the understanding deserved a moment. Seo-rin had not joined the cluster around Mok Jae. She was at the workbench, holding the master lead screw in both hands and turning it slowly, her eyes moving along its length. I watched her and said nothing. She was working something out. A true screw, she said, not quite to me, advances the same tiny distance every turn. She set one end of the screw against the bench and rested her finger on the thread flank. Mark the turns on a scale and you'd have a measure finer than the hair we keep chasing. She looked up. We could measure the truth, not just feel it. She was describing a micrometer. She had arrived at it herself, from first principles, standing in a forge-lit workshop in a dying frontier town, holding a lead screw we had lapped into existence over 4 days of patient correction. I had known this was coming, had seen the shape of it in the way she kept records, in the way she always wanted one more decimal place of certainty. But knowing it was coming did not make it less remarkable to watch arrive. Tomorrow, I said. She looked at me. That one's yours, Seo-rin. Tomorrow we turn this screw into something the old world never had, a way to measure what no eye can see. Baek Tae-ho had been quiet through most of the afternoon. He was a man who processed things slowly and completely, and the day had given him a great deal to process. Now he picked up one of the machine-cut bolts and turned it in his fingers, and when he spoke his voice had the same quality it had carried that morning over the ash sketch, wonder without performance. My grandfather filed every thread by hand, he said. No two ever matched. He'd have wept to see this. That's the gift we're really making, Baek, I said. Not the screw. The same. Sameness you can count on is the foundation of everything next. He set the bolt down carefully, as if it were something that deserved care. Perhaps it was. The fire had burned low by the time we finished cleaning the lathe and putting the tools to rest. Outside, the Vale's pale light held its usual position over the ridge, that faint dome that everyone in Iron Ridge had learned to check the way you check the weather, automatically, without quite deciding to. It was still there, still fading, in its slow way, in the way that things fade when you can only measure the change over months rather than days. Inside, on the workbench, 6 bolts lay beside 6 nuts, any one of which would fit any other. Beside them, Seo-rin's strip of paper with its columns of measurements, and the master lead screw that had taught itself to be true, and the lathe that would now cut the same thread as many times as we needed, every time, without prayer. I had grown up in my grandfather's restoration shop understanding that the hardest problems in making things are not the dramatic ones, not the pour that goes wrong, not the fire that gets away from you. The hardest problems are the quiet circularities, the places where the tool you need is the tool you're trying to make, the 3-plate method, the lead screw bootstrap, the screw that corrects the screw. You find the escape route not by breaking the circle, but by entering it carefully, at the right angle, and walking it toward true. We had walked this one home. Tomorrow, Seo-rin would take the lead screw and the scale and begin building the instrument that would let us measure what no eye could see. The thread had been cut. What came next was finer still,